The message came through channels that Earth scientists didn't even know existed. It was a Tuesday morning in Geneva when the screens in the United Nations headquarters suddenly lit up with symbols that nobody recognized. The translation software took 3 hours to decode the message, and when it finally did, every person in the room went silent. The Galactic Assembly wanted to send human military officers to their war college. Director Helen Morris read the translated message 5 times before she believed it was real. She was sitting in the emergency meeting room with holographic displays showing world leaders from every continent. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The invitation was written in formal language that reminded Helen of old diplomatic treaties. The Kelrathi War College on the fortress moon of Draven Prime had existed for 12,000 years. Only 47 species in the entire known galaxy had ever been invited to attend. Ambassador Liu Wei from China leaned forward in his holographic projection. His face showed concern despite his careful diplomatic expression. This could be an honor or it could be a trap. Earth had only made contact with alien civilizations 3 years ago. The relationship was still new and uncertain. Trade agreements were being discussed. Cultural exchange programs were in the planning stages. But nobody had expected this. General Patricia Vance spoke up from her seat at the Pentagon. She was a veteran of 3 wars, and her instincts were warning her about something. "They want to see what we can do," she said. "They want to measure us." Her weathered face was tight with suspicion. The other military leaders in the meeting nodded in agreement. The debates went on for 2 weeks. Some nations wanted to refuse the invitation. Others saw it as a chance to learn about galactic military technology. The scientists were excited about the opportunity to study alien warfare. The politicians were worried about showing too much of Earth's capabilities. In the end, the decision was made to accept. Earth would send 12 officers to represent humanity. The selection process took another month. Military branches from different nations submitted their best candidates. The selection committee looked for tactical genius, adaptability, and the ability to think in unconventional ways. They needed people who could represent humanity without giving away all of Earth's military secrets. Captain Jake Murphy was chosen from the United States Marine. Of course, he was 34 years old with sharp blue eyes and a reputation for solving impossible problems. He had commanded special operations teams in 3 different continents, and his mission reports were studied in military academies. His superiors said he could think 3 steps ahead of any opponent. Major Lisa Grant came from the Royal Air Force. She was a fighter pilot with degrees in physics and military history. Her analytical mind could break down complex problems into simple solutions. She had flown combat missions in 2 conflicts and never lost a single wingman under her command. Commander Carlos Rivera represented the Spanish Navy. He was an expert in naval warfare and logistics. He understood supply chains and resource management better than anyone in his fleet. His quiet demeanor hid a brilliant strategic mind that had won numerous wargame simulations. 9 other officers joined them from nations around the world. Each one brought unique skills and perspectives. There was Kevin Brennan, an Army Ranger who specialized in asymmetric warfare. Sarah Phillips, a submarine commander who understood stealth and misdirection. Peter Walsh, a strategic analyst who could predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. The team represented the best military minds that humanity could offer. They trained together for 6 months at a secure facility hidden in the Colorado mountains. Linguists taught them Galactic Common, which was the trade language used across civilized space. The language was difficult to learn because it used sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed to make. They practiced for hours every day until they could communicate clearly. Xenobiologists briefed them on the 14 different species they would encounter at the War College. The Vrel were insectoid beings with compound eyes and hard shells covering their bodies. They maintained the largest standing military in the known galaxy. The Onthari looked like bipedal lions with manes made of crystalline fibers that changed colors based on their emotions. They were philosophical warriors with a strong code of honor. The Gen were small humanoids with gray skin and large black eyes. Their civilization was 40,000 years old. They moved slowly and thought carefully before making any decision. There were 11 other species, each with their own biology, culture, and approach to warfare. Cultural advisors spent weeks teaching the human delegation about protocols and hierarchies. Every species had different concepts of respect and courtesy. Some considered direct eye contact to be aggressive. Others saw it as a sign of honesty. The humans learned thousands of subtle rules about how to avoid giving offense. Helen Morris visited the training facility the night before the team was scheduled to depart. She gathered all 12 officers in the briefing room and looked at each of them carefully. "You are not just students," she told them. "You are ambassadors for the entire human race. Everything you do will reflect on all of humanity. The galaxy is watching to see what kind of species we are." Jake stood with his team on the landing pad the next morning. The sky was clear and cold. They watched as a ship descended from orbit, moving with grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It was a Kelrathi transport vessel with sweeping curves and panels that glowed with soft blue light. The design was beautiful in a way that Earth's utilitarian spacecraft could never match. The landing ramp extended with a soft hiss. A figure emerged from the ship and walked down toward them. The alien was tall and reptilian with scales that shimmered between green and gold in the sunlight. It had 4 arms moving in perfect coordination. 2 arms were clasped in what appeared to be a formal greeting gesture. The other 2 arms held a data tablet. "I am Instructor Velkoth," the alien said. The translator device attached to its chest turned the clicking sounds into perfect English. "Welcome to the 247th class of the Galactic War College. Your journey begins now." The 12 humans followed Velkoth up the ramp and into the ship. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. The walls were covered with displays showing star charts and navigation data. The humans took seats that adjusted automatically to fit their bodies. The ship lifted off smoothly and climbed through Earth's atmosphere in minutes. Jake looked out the viewing port and watched his home planet shrink behind them. The blue and white sphere became smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. He felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The other species at the War College had thousands of years of experience with space travel and interstellar warfare. Some of their civilizations had existed since before humans had learned to use fire. They had fought wars across multiple star systems. They had strategies and tactics developed over timescales that humans could barely comprehend. What could Earth possibly teach beings who had been waging wars among the stars for millennia? Jake didn't know the answer to that question yet, but he had a feeling that humanity's perspective was going to surprise everyone. The transport ship engaged its faster-than-light drive and jumped into hyperspace. The stars stretched into lines of light outside the viewing ports. The journey to Draven Prime would take 3 days. 3 days before they arrived at the War College and faced the greatest test of their lives. Jake looked around at his fellow officers. Lisa was studying the star charts with intense focus. Carlos was making notes on his datapad. Kevin sat quietly with his eyes closed, probably running through combat scenarios in his mind. They were ready. They had trained for this moment. But none of them truly understood what was waiting for them on that distant fortress moon. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you invited humans to study warfare. And the humans were about to discover just how different their approach to conflict really was, compared to the rest of civilized space. Draven Prime appeared in the viewport like a gray pearl hanging in the darkness of space. The moon was tidally locked to a massive gas giant that took up half the visible sky. The surface was covered in metal structures that reflected the light from the distant star. The War College itself was built into the moon's crust with tunnels and chambers extending kilometers underground. The transport ship docked at one of the main landing bays. Jake and his team gathered their equipment and followed Instructor Velkoth through corridors that seemed to pulse with soft blue light. Other students were arriving from different docking ports. Jake saw them in the distance, alien forms that moved in ways human bodies couldn't replicate. The orientation hall was enormous. The ceiling stretched so high above them that it disappeared into shadow. Representatives from 14 other species were already arranged in groups around the chamber. Jake immediately noticed how they clustered together based on existing relationships. Some species stood close to each other while others kept obvious distance. The human delegation walked into the hall and every eye turned toward them. Jake felt the weight of those stares. The Vrel were the most noticeable with their insectoid bodies covered in chitinous armor. Their compound eyes reflected light in rainbow patterns. The Onthari stood tall and proud with their crystalline manes catching the ambient light. The Gen were small and quiet, observing everything with their large dark eyes. They looked so fragile, Jake heard someone whisper in Galactic Common. The translator in his ear rendered it into English. He kept his face neutral and led his team to an open space in the hall. Lisa stood beside him with her back straight. Carlos scanned the room carefully, analyzing the other species with a tactical eye. Commandant Throskar entered the hall through a massive doorway. He was a Vrel who stood nearly 3 meters tall. His carapace was decorated with markings that indicated high rank. His forearms moved in synchronized gestures as he addressed the assembled students. The translator turned his clicking speech into words that everyone could understand. You have been chosen because your species has demonstrated martial capacity. War is the crucible in which civilizations are tested. Here you will learn the principles that separate extinction from survival. Thruskar's mandibles moved in patterns that might have been the Vrel equivalent of a smile. This will not be easy. Many of you will fail. But those who succeed will return to your worlds as masters of warfare. The first week consisted entirely of lectures. Jake and his team sat in classrooms designed to accommodate multiple body types. The chairs adjusted automatically, but they were still uncomfortable. Instructors from various species taught them about galactic military history. They learned about conflicts that had consumed entire star systems. They studied weapons that could sterilize planets from orbit. They analyzed strategies that played out over decades or even centuries. Jake noticed something strange about all the lectures. Every war that was discussed had rules. There were protocols about which weapons could be used, agreements about protecting civilians, limitations on targeting certain types of infrastructure. Even in their most brutal conflicts, these species fought with restraint. During the tactical theory class, Instructor Pelquin presented the first practical problem. Pelquin was an Anthari veteran who had fought in 6 major campaigns. His crystalline mane was streaked with silver, indicating advanced age. He displayed a scenario on the holographic projector. A colony world needed defense against raiders who had superior numbers. Resources were limited. What was the optimal strategy? The Vrel student suggested building up the orbital defenses and forcing the raiders into a war of attrition. The Gen officer proposed opening diplomatic channels to split the raider coalition. A student from the insectoid scrin species recommended evacuating the colony and retaking it later when reinforcements arrived. Each solution was careful and measured. Pelquin turned to the humans. Captain Murphy, what is your assessment? His mane shifted through several colors that Jake had learned indicated curiosity. Jake stood up. His team had discussed this exact type of scenario during their training. We would use the colony's industrial fabricators to build improvised mines and seed them along the approach vectors. We would fake communications traffic to make the raiders think reinforcements were already on the way. Then we would send small craft-on runs designed to create debris fields that would break up their formations. When they were confused and scattered, we would hit them with everything we had. The hall went completely silent. Jake could feel the stares again, but this time they were different. There was something like shock in the air. The Vrel student who had spoken earlier stood up. His mandibles were trembling. You would sacrifice your own pilots to create debris fields. You would send them on suicide missions. Only if volunteers stepped forward, Jake replied calmly. And we would make absolutely certain the enemy knew what we had done. The psychological impact would be significant. Pelquin's mane was cycling through colors rapidly. Explain this psychological component in more detail. Lisa stood beside Jake. If the enemy believes we are willing to die to stop them, it changes everything. If they think we will use any tactic regardless of the cost to ourselves, they have to reassess their entire strategy. They might decide the colony isn't worth facing an opponent who has nothing to lose. Your species has experience with such tactics, Pelquin asked. It was not really a question. Throughout our entire history, Lisa confirmed. We have extensive documentation if you would like to review it. The instructor's expression was impossible to read, but Jake saw other students shifting in their seats. Some were leaning away from the humans. Others were leaning forward with what might have been fascination or fear. That evening, the human delegation gathered in their assigned quarters. The rooms were comfortable but designed for beings who didn't necessarily sleep lying down. Carlos was pacing back and forth across the common area. We scared them, he said. Did you see how they reacted when we described the debris field tactic? We answered honestly, Jake replied. They asked for our tactical assessment and we gave it to them. Peter Walsh was reviewing his notes on a data pad. I have been studying the galactic military doctrine they provided in the orientation materials. Everything is about minimizing casualties. Proportional response. Rules of engagement that read like legal documents. They have turned warfare into something civilized. That is insane, Kevin said from where he sat cleaning his equipment. War is not civilized. War is about survival. You do what you have to do to win. Maybe that is exactly the point, Lisa said quietly. These species have been traveling through space for thousands of years. They have forgotten what it feels like to fight for survival. They wage wars, but not the kind of wars we remember. Jake thought about human history. 2 world wars in less than 50 years. Nuclear weapons. Biological warfare. Carpet bombing. Guerrilla tactics. Total war concepts where there was no distinction between soldiers and civilians. Humanity had climbed up from primitive tribes and every step had been paid for in blood. These alien species had evolved differently. They had reached space travel and then codified their conflicts into something resembling a sport with rules. They had the luxury of fighting clean wars because they had never faced extinction. We need to be very careful, Sarah said. She was standing by the window looking out at the gas giant dominating the sky. Helen Morris warned us about this. We cannot let them see us as monsters. We are not monsters, Jake said. We are survivors. There is a difference. The next day in class, Instructor Velkoth taught them about supply chain management in interstellar warfare. He explained how fleets needed to maintain logistics lines that could stretch across multiple star systems. The lecture was detailed and technical. Jake found himself thinking about how vulnerable those supply lines would be to disruption. When Velkoth asked for questions, Jake raised his hand. What about targeting the supply lines directly? Not just disrupting them, but destroying the infrastructure they depend on. Velkoth's scales rippled in a pattern that might have indicated surprise. Such tactics are generally considered improper. Supply vessels are often minimally armed. Attacking them would be seen as cowardly. But effective, Jake pressed, if you cannot match the enemy fleet in direct combat. Removing their ability to operate would achieve the same goal. Theoretically, yes, Velkoth admitted. But such strategies are rarely employed by civilized species. Why not? Lisa asked. If the goal is to win the war, why avoid effective strategies? Because war is not just about winning, Pelquin said from where he was observing the class. It is about what kind of civilization you are when the war is over. Some victories cost more than defeats. Jake thought about that as the class continued. These aliens had a point, but he also knew that philosophy was a luxury of the strong. When your species was facing extinction, moral victories meant nothing. The human delegation was beginning to understand something important. They were not just students at this war college. They were a test. The galaxy wanted to see what humanity was capable of, and humanity was about to show them something they had forgotten existed: the willingness to do absolutely anything to survive. The simulation chamber occupied an entire wing of the war college. Jake had never seen anything like it. The room was massive enough to hold several hundred students at once. Holographic projectors covered every surface. Neural interface technology could make the simulations feel completely real. Students would experience combat from any perspective the instructors chose. They could be fleet admirals, ground commanders, or individual soldiers. Everything felt authentic except the actual death. Commandant Throskar announced the first major exercise during the morning briefing. Each species delegation would command a scenario drawn from actual historical conflicts. Performance would be evaluated on 3 criteria: tactical efficiency, casualty minimization, strategic objectives achieved. The scenarios would be different for each species, designed to test their particular approach to warfare. The Vrel went first. Jake watched from the observation gallery as they handled a hive defense scenario with mechanical precision. Their coordination was flawless. Every unit moved in perfect synchronization. They lost minimal forces while repelling the attack. The instructors nodded with approval. The Anthari demonstrated their capabilities next. Their scenario involved an orbital assault against a fortified position. They showed remarkable bravery and individual skill. Their warrior culture emphasized personal honor in face-to-face combat. The simulation showed them winning through superior fighting spirit. The casualties were higher than the Vrel approach, but still within acceptable parameters. The Gen took nearly twice as long as any other species. Their scenario was a diplomatic hostage situation. They negotiated patiently, gathered intelligence slowly, and only acted when they had perfect information. The result was a bloodless resolution that saved everyone involved. Other students murmured with admiration. Then it was humanity's turn. The scenario loaded around Jake and his team. They found themselves standing on the bridge of a simulated warship. Alarms were flashing red across every display. Status reports scrolled past faster than Jake could read them. The situation briefing appeared in front of his eyes. They were in deep space, cut off from any reinforcements. An enemy fleet was approaching with 3 times their numbers. The objective was simple: survive. Standard military doctrine was clear in this situation. Use evasive maneuvers. Conserve ammunition for critical moments. Try to reach a jump point where they could escape into hyperspace. Every tactical manual Jake had ever read said the same thing. Run and live to fight another day. Jake looked at his team. Lisa was already analyzing the enemy fleet composition on her tactical display. Carlos was checking their supply status. Kevin had that expression he always got before combat. Sarah was studying the navigation charts. Peter was running probability calculations. "What are we facing?" Jake asked Lisa. 12 capital ships and 46 support vessels. They are maintaining a standard formation. Classic Korvath battle doctrine. They are keeping their command ships in the center protected by overlapping shield bubbles. Weaknesses, Jake pressed. Lisa highlighted several points on her display. They are relying heavily on those shields. That means their armor is lighter than it should be. They are also moving in a tight formation. If something disrupted that formation, they would need time to reorganize. Jake felt a plan forming in his mind. It was insane. It violated every rule of engagement, but it might work. He looked at Carlos. How much power can we divert to forward shields and engines? Carlos checked his systems. Everything. We would have no weapons, no life support redundancy, nothing. But we could push our acceleration to maximum. Do it, Jake ordered. Lisa, plot a course straight through the center of their formation. Kevin, I need you to prepare every missile we have for simultaneous launch. Sarah, calculate the exact moment for reactor detonation. Peter, make sure this gets recorded and transmitted. I want everyone to know what we did. The observation gallery went silent as they watched the human ship suddenly accelerate. Instead of running away from the enemy fleet, it was charging directly toward them. The trajectory showed it heading straight for the center of the enemy formation. They are committing suicide, someone said. The translator carried the shocked words through the gallery. But the human ship was not firing any weapons yet. All power was redirected to shields and engines. The ship was turning itself into a kinetic projectile. The velocity kept climbing. 1% of light speed, 2%, 3%. The enemy fleet tried to respond, but their formation was designed for conventional warfare. They had positioned themselves assuming a normal engagement. By the time they understood what the humans were doing, it was too late to effectively maneuver their capital ships. At the last possible moment, the human ship fired everything. Missiles launched in every direction. Railgun rounds sprayed out in calculated patterns. Energy weapons discharged at maximum power. Even the atmosphere was vented to create additional debris clouds. Then Jake gave the final command. Sarah triggered the reactor core detonation. The explosion tore through the heart of the enemy fleet. The blast wave caught 3 capital ships at point-blank range. Shields collapsed under the overwhelming energy. Hulls fractured. The shock wave disrupted the tight formation. Ships collided with each other trying to evade. The carefully maintained shield overlaps failed. Debris from the human ship became high-velocity shrapnel that shredded lighter vessels. In the chaos that followed, the simulation showed Allied reinforcements arriving. They found an enemy fleet scattered and disorganized. Half the capital ships were destroyed or disabled. The survivors were trying to regroup, but their command structure was shattered. The Allied forces swept through and finished the engagement with minimal losses. The simulation ended. Jake and his team found themselves back in the chamber. The holographic bridge disappeared. They were standing in an empty room surrounded by absolute silence. Commandant Throssikar's voice finally broke through. "Explain your reasoning, Captain Murphy." Jake took a breath before answering. "We could not win a conventional engagement. The enemy had superior numbers and firepower. Running would only delay our destruction. So we changed the nature of the battle. We made them fight our kind of war instead of theirs." "You destroyed your own vessel," a Vrel student said. His mandibles were trembling visibly. "You killed your entire crew." "In a simulation," Jake corrected. "In a real situation, we would have evacuated all non-essential personnel first using escape pods. But the fundamental principle remains valid. Sometimes the only way to win is to do what the enemy considers unthinkable. Peter stepped forward. Every successful human military campaign throughout our history has involved this exact principle. We force the enemy to fight on our terms. If we cannot match their strengths, we attack their assumptions. We make them react to us instead of executing their plan. The observation gallery erupted. Students from different species were arguing with each other. Some looked horrified, others appeared fascinated. The instructors were conferring quietly among themselves. Instructor Pelquin watched with his crystalline mane shifting through complex color patterns. Jake had learned enough about Anthari physiology to know that meant deep contemplation. The old warrior was thinking hard about what he had just witnessed. Over the following weeks, humanity's reputation spread through the War College like wildfire. In every scenario the instructors presented, the human delegation chose aggressive and unconventional solutions. They used tactics that other species considered too extreme or too brutal. In a ground combat simulation, Kevin's team turned a civilian population center into a fortress. When an instructor questioned the ethics of using civilians as shields, Kevin had responded flatly, "In total war, there are no civilians. There are only people who have not armed themselves yet." The comment caused 3 species to formally complain to the commandant. Sarah demonstrated information warfare by creating false fleet signatures and phantom armies. She made the enemy waste resources chasing shadows that did not exist. When asked if such deception was honorable, she had laughed. "Honor is a luxury of the strong. We are not the strongest species here, so we are the smartest instead." Lisa designed a scenario where she sacrificed an entire planetary population to spread a false plague panic among enemy forces. The enemy withdrew thinking they had encountered a biological weapon. In reality, the plague was fabricated, but the psychological impact was real. The instructors did not know whether to be impressed or appalled. The other species began avoiding joint training exercises with humans. It was not contempt that drove them away. It was something closer to fear. They had invited humanity to learn from the galaxy's accumulated military wisdom. Instead, humanity was teaching them lessons they had forgotten or never knew. In the human quarters, the team debated their approach every evening. Carlos was worried they were making too many enemies. Lisa argued they were teaching valuable lessons. Jake stayed quiet most of the time, thinking about the expressions he saw on alien faces. These species had evolved to reach the stars, and then they had civilized their warfare. They fought with rules and protocols. They limited their destruction. They treated war as something that could be managed and controlled. But humanity remembered different lessons. Humanity knew that war was chaos. It was desperation. It was doing whatever was needed. The incident happened during week 8 of the training program. It was an unscheduled exercise that would later be known throughout the War College as the Draven Crisis. The instructors had designed it as a cooperative scenario where multiple species would need to work together. They deliberately paired the humans with the Vrel and Anthari, the 2 species who had shown the most discomfort with human tactics. The scenario loaded in the main simulation chamber. Jake found himself standing in a command center with holographic displays showing 3 different star systems. The situation was grim. An aggressive empire called the Krath Dominion was pushing into civilized space. 3 colony worlds were under immediate threat. Each colony had millions of inhabitants. Each colony had strategic value. But the defending forces only had enough ships and troops to protect 2 of them. The Vrel commander was an officer named Kesseral. He was a decorated veteran with markings on his carapace that indicated participation in multiple campaigns. He immediately began organizing the defense. "We fortify colonies Alpha and Beta. They have the largest populations and the most important manufacturing facilities. Colony Gamma must be abandoned. We evacuate as many civilians as possible." The Anthari representative was a warrior named Thelmos. He was massive even by Anthari standards, with a mane that showed streaks of battle scars. He nodded in agreement with Kesseral. "It is a logical decision. We cannot save everyone. We must prioritize based on strategic value and population size." Jake studied the tactical displays carefully. He looked at the positioning of the 3 colonies. He examined the hyperspace routes connecting them. He analyzed the Krath fleet movements and their probable objectives. Something about the standard solution bothered him. What if we do not defend any of them? Jake said quietly. The room went completely silent. Even the background hum of the simulation seemed to pause. Explain immediately, Kesserall demanded. His mandibles were clicking in agitation. Jake pulled up the star chart and highlighted a position in deep space between the 3 colonies. We pull all our forces back to this location. We let the Krath take all 3 colonies without a fight. That is madness, Thelmos growled. His mane was flashing angry red colors. You would abandon millions of civilians to enemy occupation. You would surrender 3 strategic positions without firing a single shot. Lisa stood up beside Jake. She had been working through the same logic. We evacuate who we can, but we leave all the infrastructure intact. The factories, the spaceports, the power generation facilities, the communication networks. Everything the Krath wants. Kevin was grinning now because he understood where this was going. And then we rig every single piece of that infrastructure to explode. We turn the colonies into traps. The Vrel commander's carapace actually changed color. It shifted from its normal green to a pale gray that Jake had learned indicated extreme distress. You are talking about destroying your own colonies. You are proposing to turn 3 inhabited worlds into death traps for the enemy. Peter brought up tactical projections on his display. The Krath move fast and consolidate quickly. They will occupy all 3 colonies within 72 hours. They will move their fleets into orbit. They will land occupation forces. They will begin using the infrastructure to support their continued advance. That concentration becomes their greatest vulnerability. Sarah added more details to the projection. If we destroy the infrastructure they are depending on, we do not just deny them resources. We trap their forces on worlds that can no longer support them. No power, no communications, no supplies. Their fleets will be stranded in orbit trying to evacuate their ground forces. Carlos finished the strategy. Meanwhile, our forces are concentrated at a single defensive position instead of being spread across 3 separate battles. When the Krath are overextended and dealing with logistics nightmares in 3 different systems, we launch a coordinated counterattack. We retake all 3 colonies while they are in chaos. Jake looked at the alien officers. And we make absolutely certain the Krath know exactly what we did. We broadcast it on every communication channel. We tell them that any world they take from us comes with a price, that we will burn our own colonies to ash rather than let them have them. Thelmos stood slowly. His entire body was trembling with emotion. This is barbarism. You speak of scorched earth tactics. You speak of total war. These concepts were abandoned thousands of years ago by civilized species. They are considered crimes against sentient life itself. Maybe you abandoned them too early, Carlos said. His voice was calm but firm. The Krath in this scenario are not civilized. They are conquerors. You cannot fight them with proportional responses and rules of engagement. They will not honor your protocols. Then what separates us from them? Thelmos demanded. If we adopt their methods and become as ruthless as they are, what have we actually defended? What is the point of survival if we lose everything that makes us worth saving? Jake met the Anthari warrior's eyes without flinching. Everything. You survive first, you rebuild your civilization second. You can restore your culture and your values after the war is over, but you cannot rebuild anything if you are extinct. Dead civilizations do not get to keep their moral high ground. The debate continued for hours. Other instructors were called to observe. Commandant Throskar himself arrived to watch the argument unfold. The humans defended their strategy with cold logic. They cited examples from their own history. Battles where desperate tactics had meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Kesserall argued passionately against the human approach. He spoke about the value of civilization itself, about the principles that separated thinking beings from animals, about the cost of victory when you sacrifice everything you believe in to achieve it. Finally, Throskar made a decision. We will test both strategies in parallel simulations. The humans will execute their plan. Commander Kesserall will execute the standard defensive doctrine. We will compare the outcomes. The simulations ran simultaneously on different displays. The standard defense saved colonies Alpha and Beta. Colony Gamma fell to the Krath. The war that followed was long and costly. It took years of careful fighting to eventually push the Krath back. Casualties were acceptable by galactic standards, but the economic cost was enormous. The human strategy lost all 3 colonies in the first week. The images of civilian evacuations were heartbreaking, but when the Krath tried to consolidate their gains, everything fell apart. Infrastructure exploded across all 3 worlds. Krath fleets found themselves stranded. Ground forces were trapped without supplies. The coordinated human counterattack caught them completely unprepared. Within 2 months in the simulation timeline, all 3 colonies were retaken. Total casualties were 30% lower than the standard approach. Economic recovery time was projected to be half as long. The humans had won. The numbers proved it objectively. But the silence in the observation gallery was heavy with something more than respect. It was a silence filled with fear and recognition. That evening, Instructor Pelquin came to the human quarters. His mane was showing subdued blue colors that indicated deep thought. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. I fought in the Onthari-Vrel border wars. 3 decades of conflict. Millions died over disputed territory. But we followed protocols throughout. We limited our weapons. We respected sanctuaries. We honored truces. Both civilizations survived with their cultures intact. Jake waited for Pelquin to continue. Watching your strategies forces me to consider an uncomfortable question. What if we had faced an enemy who did not share our values? An enemy who would not honor protocols or respect limitations? An enemy who wanted nothing less than our complete destruction? Then you would have lost, Jake said simply. You would have fought honorably, and you would have died honorably. And your enemy would have erased your civilization from existence. Pelquin's mane flickered through several colors rapidly. That is what terrifies us about your species, Captain Murphy. Not that you are strong. You are not the strongest species in this college. But you remember something we have all forgotten. You remember that survival is not guaranteed, that civilization is fragile, that sometimes the only way to preserve what you love is to be willing to destroy it yourself rather than let your enemy have it. Is that a compliment or an accusation? Jake asked. I genuinely do not know, Pelquin admitted. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it is a warning. Your species has only been in space for a few years, yet you think like survivors of 1,000 wars. That knowledge makes you dangerous. But it might also make you necessary. The instructor left without another word. Jake sat alone thinking about what had happened. The galaxy had rules for warfare. They had made combat civilized. But somewhere out in the darkness of space, there might be enemies who did not care about those rules. And when that enemy arrived, the galaxy would need to remember how to fight like humans. The final month at the War College brought changes that nobody had anticipated. The initial fear and horror that other species showed toward human tactics slowly transformed into something more complex. Some students still avoided the humans completely. They would change direction in corridors to prevent encounters. They would request transfers to different training groups, but others began seeking out the human delegation with questions. It started small. A Gen officer named Shenra approached Lisa during a break between tactical exercises. The Gen were ancient and careful, known throughout the galaxy for their patience and risk-averse nature. Shenra had barely spoken during the first 2 months of training. Your discussion of psychological warfare from week 2, Shenra said. Her large eyes were unblinking. I have been researching human history. During your Cold War period, both major powers possessed weapons that could destroy all life on your planet. Is this correct? Lisa nodded. Nuclear weapons. Yes, we built enough to kill ourselves many times over, and neither side used them because both sides knew the other would retaliate. Mutual destruction was guaranteed. Shenra's thin fingers tapped a rhythm on her data pad. This is a uniquely human innovation. Other species developed apocalyptic weapons, but always with controls and agreements. Humanity weaponized extinction itself and called it peace. It worked though, Lisa said. It was terrifying, but it prevented a third world war. Shenra tilted her head in what might have been agreement. That is precisely my point. You survived by making survival itself into a weapon. Other species here evolved through cooperation. Intelligence emerged from group selection and mutual benefit. But humanity's evolution was competitive and individual. You climb to consciousness over the bodies of every other intelligent species on your world. Your psychology is fundamentally shaped by that history. Lisa considered the words carefully. You want to know if that makes us too dangerous? No, Shenra replied. I want to know if that makes you necessary. The conversation spread through the college network. Other species began approaching the humans not with accusations but with genuine curiosity. What emerged was a growing understanding that humanity represented something unique in galactic civilization. They were survivors who still remembered survival. The Vrel proved surprisingly adaptable despite their initial shock. Kesrel sought out Jake during a simulation cooldown period. In our hive structure, individual sacrifice for the collective is instinctive, but we limit that sacrifice through protocols and honor codes. You humans have protocols too, but you abandon them when survival demands it. This flexibility is what we lack. Jake shook his head. It is not flexibility. It is desperation refined into doctrine. We learned these tactics because we had no choice. Perhaps Kesseral's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. But there is wisdom in remembering desperation even after you have achieved security. My people have been safe for so long we have forgotten what existential threat feels like. The final examination was announced during week 11. Each delegation would face a scenario designed specifically to test everything they had learned. The instructors made it clear these would be the most challenging situations possible. Pass or fail would determine whether a species was truly ready to face galactic-level warfare. The humans knew their test would be particularly difficult. They had spent 3 months challenging every assumption and protocol the War College taught. The instructors would design something meant to push them to their absolute limits. The scenario loaded on a gray morning. Jake and his team found themselves designated as military advisors to a peaceful species, facing their first interstellar war. The enemy was technologically superior with better weapons and more ships. Standard tactics had all failed. The client species was facing complete extinction. They had turned to humanity's delegation as their last hope. The team had 12 simulated hours to develop a comprehensive strategy. They worked through the night without rest. Coffee equivalents were consumed in vast quantities. Arguments broke out over details. But slowly a plan emerged. Jake kept reminding everyone of a crucial fact. This was not about showing off human tactics. This was about genuinely saving a civilization that had no experience with total war. When morning came, they presented their strategy to a packed observation gallery. Every student and instructor had come to watch. Commandant Throskar sat in the front row. The weight of expectation was almost physical. Jake stood before the assembled aliens and began speaking. First principle. You cannot win by becoming something you are not. If your civilization has no cultural concept of total war, you cannot develop it overnight. Trying will destroy what you are trying to save, Lisa continued. Second principle. Every species has inherent strengths. This civilization's strength is their diplomacy and their moral standing in the galactic community. That is not a weakness to overcome. That is a weapon to employ. Kevin outlined the core strategy. They would announce publicly that this peaceful species had hired human military advisors. They would deliberately leak selected information about human tactical doctrine. The most aggressive examples, the most shocking scenarios. The enemy would learn that continued assault meant facing opponents advised by the species that had terrified the entire War College. You are using your own reputation as a psychological weapon, Pelquin observed. His mane was shifting through interested colors. Exactly, Jake confirmed. Meanwhile, the actual defense uses coordinated diplomacy to isolate the enemy politically. Economic pressure to undermine their war capability. Limited military action designed not to win battles, but to make the war expensive enough that domestic support collapses. Peter brought up detailed projections. We humans become the monsters in the story. The scary advisors who might recommend terrible things. The enemy overestimates the threat. They become cautious. They make mistakes. Meanwhile, the peaceful species maintains their moral authority while negotiating from a position of strength. Sarah added the final element. If the enemy does escalate, we have contingency plans that get progressively more aggressive. But each level is designed to give the enemy an exit. We make it clear that peace is available, but continued war will become increasingly costly. The simulation ran for what felt like hours. The strategy was not perfect. Some battles were lost. Territory was temporarily occupied. Civilians suffered. But the enemy's will broke before the defenders did. The war ended through negotiated peace rather than conquest. The peaceful civilization survived intact. Their culture was preserved. Their values remained uncorrupted. When the results appeared, they showed something remarkable. Casualties were 70% lower than any other proposed solution. Economic damage was minimal. Recovery time was projected at under 5 years. Most importantly, the peaceful species had not been forced to abandon their fundamental nature. Commandant Throskar stood to address the observation gallery. His voice carried weight earned through 12,000 years of institutional authority. This class has been unlike any in our history. The inclusion of humanity has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We have become so civilized in our warfare that we forgot warfare's fundamental nature. It is about survival, not honor. It is about continuation, not protocol. He turned to face the human delegation directly. You have shown us our blind spots. You have reminded us that somewhere in this vast galaxy, there may exist threats that do not share our values or our restraint. When we face such threats, the lessons you have taught will be invaluable. Thelmos approached Jake during the graduation ceremony. His mane showed colors that Jake had learned meant respect mixed with lingering concern. I do not like your methods, Captain Murphy. They disturb me on a fundamental level. But I understand their necessity now. That understanding is both gift and curse. Jake met the warrior's eyes. The lesson is not to abandon civilization. The lesson is to know when protocols serve you and when they limit you. To understand the difference between wars of conquest and wars of survival, and to never forget that civilization is a choice you make every day, not a guarantee. The 12 human officers returned to Earth 3 weeks later. They were welcomed as heroes, though most details remained classified. What did leak out was enough. Humanity had attended the galaxy's most prestigious military academy and left an impression that would last for generations. But they had also taught something valuable. In a galaxy that had forgotten existential warfare, humanity served as a living reminder. Not a threat, but a warning. Not conquerors, but survivors who remembered the price of survival. The Galactic Assembly's official response arrived 3 months after the humans returned home. Helen Morris called Jake to her office in Geneva to share the news personally. She was smiling in a way that suggested both pride and apprehension. They want to establish a permanent human presence at the War College. Not as students, but as instructors. They are creating a new department called Existential Warfare Studies. Jake sat down slowly. They want us to teach them how to be desperate. Helen nodded. How to fight without rules when everything is on the line. How to make hard choices. How to do whatever survival requires. They are being very careful about the phrasing, but that is the essence of it. Are we accepting? Jake asked. Yes, Helen said, but carefully. We are not teaching them to be